my first meeting with Lenny took place several years before I actually worked with him the first time. I was singing Oedipus Rex by Stravinsky at the Hollywood Bowl with Michael Tilson Thomas. And it was, I think, 1980. Anyway, it was a very wild, sort of semi-staged Oedipus in which we were all wearing costumes that were somewhere between Star Trek and Star Wars. And I remember my costume had a big Flash Gordon lightning bolt down the front of it. And big double row of buttons. And after the performance was over, I had no idea Lenny was there. He came into my dressing room. I heard a knock on the door. And I opened the door, and there was Leonard Bernstein standing there, tanned and looking gorgeous, cigarette in one hand, glass of scotch in the other. And he starts singing Oedipus's first line and puts his arm around me and says, "That was really great, kid." Like this. And that was my introduction to Lenny. A couple of years later, when he and Stephen Wadsworth were putting together not Trouble in Tahiti, Quiet Place, I was asked to come up and sing for Lenny again. And I said, "Well, what should I sing?" And he said, "Well, bring some things in English for Lenny." So I think I sang something from The Rake's Progress. I sang, some Rodgers and Hammerstein or something, and a song by John Alden Carpenter called Serenade. And it's that particular song is a big sort of a tango number that Carpenter wrote in the 20s. Lenny had never heard it before. Now, there's something that you actually could perform music that Lenny had not heard, and he leapt up out of his seat and said, "That's a great fucking song!" And he comes and runs over to the piano and starts to play it. He said, "That's a great song." He says, "Damn, I wish I could sing." And as it turned out, they asked me to do something in Quiet Place, but I was not available and couldn't become available. So, I kicked myself for that. When we finally worked together on a project for the first time, it was in 86, I think it was, or 87. We did a recording of Puccini's La Bohème. Subsequent to that, then I did a couple of other big projects with him, Mozart Requiem, and of course Candide. And during that time, I got to know Lenny on lots of different levels.
Talk about the experience of La Bohème.
La Bohème was exhausting and fraught with all kinds of ups and downs. And I know that subsequent to the project and during the project, Lenny took a lot of grief on lots of levels because, number one, he was in Rome with an all-American cast, doing one of the two or three most well-known Italian operas. And the Italian, I felt that that we were sort of in the lion's den there. Hanging over the edge, because there we were in the middle of, we were like, at Santa Cecilia, which is just across the street from the Vatican. And there we are doing this quintessentially Italian opera with a bunch of Americans. He also took a lot of grief for the fact that he hired to do Mimi, Angelina Reo, who had never really done an opera before. And behind the scenes, there were lots of, machinations in some instances and a lot of yapping going on that, you have to replace her, you have to replace her, you have to replace her. I was in kind of a strange position there because, this was my alter ego. And I must say, I gained a lot of respect for Angie over the course of that because it took cast iron guts to insert oneself into a situation like that, knowing that everybody's focus was on her. When are you going to screw up, kid? And I remember there was an instance in which there were several other sopranos that were sort of being kept on the sidelines, ready to jump in at a moment's notice. And there was an incident that happened that to me was so illustrative of what Leonard Bernstein, Beyond All the Hype, was about. They were trying to get him to replace Angie. And, I mean, at that point, Angie was really doing a more than credible job with the whole thing. She really rose to the occasion. But when they tried to talk Lenny into replacing her, I remember overhearing a conversation that I was not supposed to hear, in which Lenny said, "I can't replace her. She has given me a year of her life, and I can't just cast her off like that, no matter what you think." Now, there are lots of people in the world that would have taken the easy way out and would have found a way to eschew all the criticism and all the flack that was coming his way. He didn't. And I think at the end of the day, whether or not that recording goes down as a good bohème, a bad bohème, an indifferent bohème, it isn't because of whether or not Angie Rayo was the best or worst or most indifferent me of all, because at the end of the day, we were all there as an ensemble doing what I thought was our best work at the time. I think the recording is quirky because of Lenny's approach to it. It had nothing to do with any individual performers.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that one comes away from La Bohème wanting a sense of youth and a sense of joie de vivre and a sense that there is nothing ahead of you but tomorrow's, which is why the tragedy of her death is so potent and so moving. When it all came out at the end of the day, what it appeared to me to be was the elegy of someone who was looking back on his creative youth. Because there's a tremendous, I think, there's a tremendous sense of reminiscence, a tremendous sense of, yes, there's a lot of joy in it, but there's a lot of bittersweetness in it from the very beginning. And I remember during the rehearsal process for Bohème, Lenny was constantly, every once in a while some anecdotal reference would be made to, to when he was studying with such and such or so, or the early days at Tango. He talked a lot about Kusevitsky during those things. And I remember he had those, Kusevitsky's cufflinks were always there. And it was an interesting experience from lots of different levels. It was the first time I'd ever worked with Lenny musically. And you talk about somebody that pushed the envelope. That was Lenny. I may be getting ahead of myself, but what I wrote, I was asked when he died, as were a lot of us, to write a paragraph or a few sentences about our thoughts on Lenny's passing. And I frankly had no idea what to write, but what I came up with, I think, is germane to that creative experience. I'd gone for several days and tried to write things down, and I couldn't. And finally I went to bed one night and just said, well, the hell with it, I'll come up with something. And I woke up in the middle of the night and felt compelled to write these 3 sentences, and I don't know where they came from. I said, Leonard Bernstein introduced me to a world without fear. For Lenny, there were no limitations. There were only possibilities. And when I stood on the podium or on the stage and looked into his eyes as he was conducting, I believed that neither were the gates of hell inassailable nor the gates of heaven unattainable. Now that's what it was like to work with him, because I had done, 60, 70 performances of Bohème at that point in my life. And whenever you picked up a piece of music with Lenny, you could be confident that he had studied that piece backwards and forwards, and his frame of reference was as broad as it gets. But he had this remarkable ability to be able somehow to trust that that was all going to be there if he jumped off the cliff with both feet and tried something that perhaps went against convention, or that most people would say, I can't do that. And I remember those rehearsals being a constant exercise in pushing me beyond what I could do. And I'll tell you, there were many, many moments in those rehearsals when we all felt that we were teetering on the edge of being not only over the top, but down in some abyss someplace, because all of the landmarks that we were used to having as performers, the emotional landmarks, the stylistic landmarks, the psychological landmarks, Lenny would constantly try to shatter, so that you really felt as though you were really, maybe not boldly going where no man had gone before, but certainly going where no man had gone before. And I remember particularly the attitude of the orchestra of Santa Cecilia, whom I had performed with on other occasions with other conductors. And like a lot of great orchestras who are faced with somebody that has either a new take on something or someone who hasn't proven himself in their eyes, orchestra players can be very difficult, as we all can, I suppose. But I remember rehearsals where, with them, where a conductor would come to the podium and tap his baton like this, and they would continue doing whatever they were doing for 20 minutes until the union steward stood up and went, "Signore, signori, per favore." Well, they had made their point that they were in charge. With Lenny, it was different because they paid attention, but whatever skepticism they had about his approach to that piece, within about a day or two, was gone. And they appreciated going on this journey too, and they appreciated having their cages rattled and being asked to question what they took as a matter of course. They seemed to enjoy being given permission to be naughty. And what I mean by that is being given permission to do it in a way that was unconventional, and to do it in a way which wasn't the prescribed way of doing things. At the end of the day, of course, I think Lenny was incapable of doing anything that was grossly inappropriate, because that he simply lived, breathed, slept, and ate music, so that it was impossible for him. And it was always, I think, a matter of degree and a matter of balance and a matter of what the listener's personal taste might be. But it was a really rollicking adventure, I'll tell you that. And subsequent to doing that with him, I had to put bohème away for a while. And I've only done it, I think, twice since, because I think that with that particular piece, I felt like we had pulled it apart to the point where I could never go back and do bohème well again in a conventional way, because my whole idea about it had been shattered. However, that profoundly affected and changed the way I approached everything I have done since. I think that my performances in general have had more depth. I think I've been more willing to take personal risks. I think that I've been more willing to question, why am I doing it this way? What is it that I'm trying to accomplish? And am I just going through the motions? Because I think the thing that made Lenny craziest, at least in my experience, was people who illustrated to the audience the degree of homework that they had done, as opposed to being spontaneous human beings who were communicating something. I remember that there was a rehearsal for the Benedictus of the Mozart Requiem, and the solo quartet, dutifully went through it with Lenny. And of course, with Lenny, it was, no matter how intimate that you were with him as a person, no matter how much Lenny tried to put you at ease and tried to be one of the guys, he was still Leonard Bernstein. He was still the guy I grew up with in Central Illinois on television. He's still the guy that invented music for me. And so there was always this part of you that was going, I'm here singing for Leonard Bernstein. I can't screw up, right? So we went through the Benedictus, and we, as we were singing it, we all thought that we were, pretty good at what we were doing. And I will never forget this as long as I live. He threw down his baton, sort of frustratedly, took a big drag on his cigarette, and he said, "God damn it, I know you did your homework." And we all looked at him like that. And he looked at us and he said, "Don't you realize that your brains and your preparation and everything that you've learned about Mozart up to this point in your lives is not going to leave you for a second if you engage your hearts?" And we all went, yeah, you're right. Lenny gave everybody permission to fail. Now that sounds strange, doesn't it? But that's what it's about. You have to not be afraid to fail. The other thing about him in performances was that, well, two things. A performance with Leonard Bernstein was not simply a musical experience. Because oftentimes, I'll give you a prime example. In Vienna in 1988, I was there doing something with the Vienna State Opera. And it so happened that Lenny was coming through to conduct the Wiener Philharmonic. They were going to do the Sibelius Second Symphony, which is in itself sort of a life journey symphony. I attended the Saturday rehearsal and then attended the Sunday morning performance that they did. And I will never forget those two moments because it was, there was a small audience at the rehearsal, and then of course they had the house packed at the performance. And it was like being at a rock concert. The degree of involvement on the part of the audience was palpable. And when they finished that last movement, the place just went nuts. And also the rehearsal was exciting. I rushed out to buy the live recording that had been made of that as soon as it was released. And it was disappointing. Not because it was done badly musically, but it wasn't the totality of a Bernstein performance. Because he exuded a life force on the podium that was undeniable. And his almost childlike ability to experience that music that he knew like the back of his hand and experience it as if he were hearing it for the first time was so infectious to everybody. I remember looking at the double basses. Now, the Wiener Philharmonic can be at sometimes a rather dour lot because of the culture they come from and because of the pressure that's on them to always be the Wiener Philharmonic. I will never forget looking at those double basses, who I had never seen smile in 15 years of singing with them, and they were playing like this. And that was because of Lenny. The other thing about a Bernstein performance, in my experience, was that it often went way over the top. Because everybody got carried along in that enthusiasm. Everybody got carried along in wanting to break the bounds of where they had been before with any piece. But when it started to go awry, whether it was because of a choice Lenny made, but particularly when it was a choice that somebody else made, Lenny never, ever let anybody hang out to dry. He never, ever said, "No, that's not the way I want to do it." Now, he may do that in rehearsal, but in performance, if somebody was seized by, a moment of inspiration or something, or a moment of insanity, Lenny was right there and said, "You want to go that way? Let's go. Let's see what happens." And no matter what happened, if it started to go wrong, if everybody sensed that it started to go wrong, everybody would focus their attention on Lenny. And I remember instances when he knew it was, when we were going into the garbage heap, when he would just give us a little smile like that and go, yeah, I know, come on now, I'll get it back together. And then we would be back on firm footing. But I've never, ever met anybody, another conductor like that, with the possible exception of James Levine. Jimmy has a lot of the same qualities that Lenny has in terms of the risk-taking abilities. And of course, he was, Jimmy and Lenny were great were great friends, so that's not surprising. But it was extraordinary with Lenny because it was as if he was making love to you, in the best sense of that word, when he was performing or when he was conducting you, when you were working with him. It was a real soul partnership. And I think the people that had bad experiences with Lenny, and I'm sure you'll talk to them too, they had bad experiences because they weren't willing to go along for the ride, and it was a hell of a ride.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. He really got his sustenance, didn't he, from music? I mean, it was...
Yep. All kinds of music. I never heard him badmouth any kind of music ever. For him, it was all part of the same fabric, whether it was a rap song or the Beatles or... Well, I'll give you... this is sort of an interesting sidelight, but right after Lenny died, we were asked, some of us, to participate in the memorial service at Carnegie Hall. The day that... I guess it was the day before... Wait a minute, I've got to get my chronology straight. They had called to ask me to do the Carnegie Hall thing. That same day, I got a fax from Paul McCartney's office asking me to come over and meet him because he was interested in my doing the Liverpool Oratorio with him, which I eventually did. And so there I was, and he wanted me to come on the same day as the memorial service. So do I fish or cut bait here? And I said, well, I have to do the memorial service. So I swallowed really hard, and I composed this fax, and I said, well, you're never going to get to work with one of the Beatles now because you're an idiot and you're doing this. And I sent him the fax saying, I can't come on Thursday or whatever it was because I have to do this memorial service for Leonard Bernstein. And I hope you'll understand. I got a fax back almost immediately, within minutes. And it said, of course you have to sing for Leonard Bernstein. He meant a lot to all of us. Signed, Paul McCartney. You know, his influence on everybody was just astounding. And I can remember at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when Lenny was well into his cups, Lenny would sit down and start playing at the piano. And he would play these improvised piano fantasies in which he would start with Beethoven and go through Rodgers and Hart and the Beatles, and then he'd poke fun at Schoenberg and Berg and weave his way back, and he would make reference to just about everybody that you can imagine. His frame of reference was unbelievable.
Would he talk about it while he was doing it?
No, he'd just do it. He'd just do it.
What did he say when he was at his cups? What are some of the things he talked about?
You name it. He did it. See, the thing is, I've read all the things that have been written about Lenny since he died, and I don't pretend to have known him on the same level that other people knew him, intimately, personally. But Lenny was the kind of a guy that was so open with everybody. My impression meeting him was that he desperately wanted to be, this is only my impression of it, I think he wanted to be one of the guys. But he couldn't be, because he wasn't one of the guys. He was what we all aspired to be. And he went to great pains to put people at their ease, and he went to great pains to use whatever was the current vernacular expressions to, I don't know, it was his way of saying to us, yeah, I know I'm Leonard Bernstein and I know who I am, but I put my trousers on one leg at a time like you do. So relax. Anyway, I've read all those things that people have written about him, both good and bad. And in my experience, they're probably all true. But you can't judge Leonard Bernstein on the basis merely of the tabloid kind of exposés that are written about his human weaknesses. I think the only reason that we're interested in his human weaknesses is because the greatness that he achieved on so many fronts seems to be so unbelievable. How can one person do all that? That somehow we want to find the chink in his armor. To me, the thing that gives me hope as somebody who is profoundly flawed is that it's possible to be flawed and to still achieve greatness. Because he did. I mean, he was it. I almost said is a genius, because I don't feel in some ways that he's ever left those of us who worked with him. But he was a genius. I used the word life force before, but that life force was it was pulsating and palpable. You know, you talk about the force. George Lucas doesn't know about the force because I don't think he ever worked with Leonard Bernstein. That was the force. And it was both the dark side and the light side all rolled up into one. But without all that stuff that people like to point their fingers at and say, oh, well, see, he did this and he did that and he wasn't so great after all. I think it was the same capacity in him that allowed him to go to the heights, also allowed him to go to the depths. And I don't think that he would have been Leonard Bernstein had he not had that capacity, to be quite honest with you. To answer your question, what did he talk about when he was in his cups? It was open season, and he talked about everything. It was impossible to be bored around him. You could get angry, because Lenny could be maddeningly childish and maddeningly petulant. And there were times when you thought, do you have to be the center of attention all the time? And of course the answer to that question is yes, because you're a hell of a lot more interesting than any one of us here. You know, you could take the combined experience of any room full of people and add it up, and it wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting as one day out of the life of Leonard Bernstein. So, sure, be the center of attention. I don't care.
How do you account for that seeming contradiction that he wanted to be one of the guys, which I truly believe.
Yeah.
But he also needed to be the center of attention all the time. How do you...
I think it was profound self-awareness. How could you not... I'm going to answer your question, or try to answer your question by using an analogous incident that I have experienced. I also know Joan Sutherland and Richard Bonning relatively well. Well, Joan Sutherland, as opera singers go, is certainly a legend, one of the great legends of the 20th century. And when I first got to work with her, was in the early 80s. It was right around the time I met Lenny. And of course, you know, I thought, what's a kid from Peoria doing on stage with Joan Sutherland? And I said something to that effect, or even goofier to her. And I said, you know, I feel so out of my element here working with a legend. And she said something to me that I think Lenny must have felt all the time in his own way, but he never articulated it like this to me. She said, you know, I think that I am a very ordinary woman to whom God has given an extraordinary ability. And I think in Lenny's case, he was an ordinary human being. I don't mean ordinary in the sense that, I mean, obviously he was a gifted person, but God gave him so many gifts. He never was able to define who he was himself, because when he was, the old joke was when you complimented Lenny on being a great conductor, he'd say, no, I'm a composer. And then you compliment him on that, and he'd say, no, I'm a teacher. And you say, no, and he said, no, I'm not a teacher, I'm a writer, and everything. Everything that he did well. And you would have had to be deaf, dumb, and blind. One would have to be deaf, dumb, and blind, not to say, holy mackerel, look what I've done. When I walk into a room, look at what happens. Now, I don't know what that feels like, but there must be, at the risk of trying to be an amateur psychologist, there must be a longing for a kind of a normalcy and a kind of an anonymity that he never had. He was totally recognizable wherever he went. You know, he couldn't go down to a corner bar and say, you know, give me a Bud Light. Because if Lenny did that, that was news. If you and I did it, who cares? Lenny, to me, was the quintessential example of all the good things and all the bad things about celebrity. Because, well, anybody with that much to give, and as you said to me, and it's true, he gave and gave and gave and gave and gave. You need to get something back. And I think that on a one-to-one basis, most people with whom Lenny came into contact were so overwhelmed by him, by his aura, by his accomplishments, by his fame, that even when he opened himself up and gave you everything he had to give, you were not always sure how to respond. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that left an empty place there for him. Certainly there was nobody that I think there are very few people in the world that probably were his intellectual equals. You know, who can he sit around and chew the fat with that's going to really understand him? I remember conversations with him where I know that he was not trying to be in any way superior or off-putting to me, but I could see in his face that as he was having an everyday mundane conversation with me, that there were several other levels of thought that were going on. And his insatiable curiosity and his ability to extrapolate off of anything that was given to him and have a thought about it, some kind of a creative thought, that must have been incredibly maddening to him, to not really have anybody who, you know, was his equal. I was joking with you about jokes. I love to tell jokes, and I love to tell stories and anecdotes and everything like that. Anybody that knows me well will attest to that. And Lenny was a great storyteller. And he loved to tell jokes. And the more, and sometimes the dirtier the joke, the better. And I know a few of those myself. And we would go one-on-one. I didn't mean for it to evolve into that, but he would say something and it would make me think of three other jokes. I said, would you hear the one about blah, 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 blah. And we would go like this, and it got to the point where it was the only part of my relationship with Leonard Bernstein where I felt like I came close to approaching him as an equal. Now, many people would say that we were both dragged down to this level, but anyway, for that moment where we were telling jokes, we were like this. And it got to the point that towards the end of his life, when we were doing Candide, I remember we were going back and forth at one point, and he said, "No!" He said, "I'm telling the last joke, so shut up." And I don't know. I think that need to be the center of attention, I articulate it that way. I don't think that it was. I never got the sense that it grew out of his selfishness or out of his any kind of an unsavory egotism. I think that he just gave and gave and gave to the point where it needed to be replenished somehow. And that was a way that he did it. And he was surrounded by people. His inner circle were people that made sure that was done. And I don't pretend to know how that inner circle worked because I only observed it. But it was clear to me that the people around him knew that he needed that, and they made sure they got it.
You talk about the inner circle. There's an inner circle which I would consider different from all those people who were around him at the end that everyone refers
Yes.
to. Where the inner circle was the family and
Yeah.
Betty. And is that what you're talking about when you say the inner
No, I mean the people that were his professional inner circle, his army of assistants and things like that, because I think they tried to anticipate all of his needs, whether or not he articulated them or not. And that's a hell of a daunting task. I mean, how do you anticipate the needs of somebody who's larger than life? I don't think I could have done it.
Well, you were talking earlier about, maybe we might as well just jump to this since we're on it, about what you perceive the negative effect of so many yes men around him, or yes people around him, at the end of his life, and kind of separation from reality causing his life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I've observed a few people that I would put in the same category of celebrity as Lenny. Certainly there's Paul McCartney. There's Lenny. I had a passing acquaintance with Gene Kelly. And people that are in that situation where everybody is there ready to take a piece out of them and ready to say, like this, tend to surround themselves, and I think they need to for purposes of sanity. They surround themselves with people that keep the world out in an effort that something normal can exist in a hermetically sealed bubble. It's contradiction in terms. In the case of Paul McCartney, he's managed it brilliantly because he and Linda have managed to have a real life. And, of course, with him there was the added thing that after John Lennon was assassinated, I don't know this for a fact, but I assume that, then there's the added concern of, well, what if some kook tries to take a shot at me? Well, somebody could have, I'm supposed, taken a shot at Lenny. And anyway, the McCartneys have raised 3 incredibly decent and normal children who are good people. Now that says a lot about the atmosphere that they created in that bubble. I think with Lenny, my perception of it, and again, I'm not an expert on this because I'm only an observer, but I think that Lenny's life was in many ways tremendously hectic and overbooked, and I don't think my feeling in the 10 years or 12 years that I was around him regularly, it didn't appear to me that he ever had any quiet time. It never appeared to me that he really had any time that was his own, because there were so many demands being made on his time, and there were so many people around him that were making sure that he got to where he had to be at a certain time, that his whatever he needed to study was always there and everything. And I mean, I was not privy to what actually went on behind those closed doors. But I know that there were always, seemingly a dozen people or so that were, I think, trying their best to help him, but people don't live that way. Most of the rest of the world doesn't live like that. And I think, perhaps that's the price of that kind of celebrity. And we can all sit back and we can analyze it and we can say, well, if he hadn't sought the celebrity, then blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's that easy, though. It seemed to me that with Lenny it was a strange mix, because I never witnessed him giving in any way that was calculated or false. Personally, I never saw that. Never. And when you have that capacity to be so open, I I think you're going to invite everything. You attract everything into your life, and you need to have people that are pushing it away, trying to keep you at arm's length. So I think that there's a strange sense of, not unreality, but irreality that creeps in. It's not a question of it being real or unreal. It's something else. It exists somewhere in the middle. And, it's all speculation, I think. If Lenny had lived a normal life, would he have been Lenny? I don't think so. I don't think we'd love Lenny. I don't think that he would be so fascinating to us if he'd been normal. It's the fact that he is a bad boy genius that makes him appealing. It's the same reason why we're much more fascinated with John Wilkes Booth than we are with Edwin Booth. And, if you look at the two lives, John Wilkes Booth's life was a failure, but he killed a president, and that's interesting to us because he's a bad boy. Edwin Booth had so many accomplishments on the American stage that, it would take us all day to recount them. I mean, what other actor do you know that could perform Hamlet 100 consecutive nights? And he did that. Without a break, 100 nights in a row did Hamlet. And we don't care about that. But which of the two things serves the human soul more? What John Wilkes did or what Edwin did? To judge Lenny on the basis of like I said before, his foibles, to me is insane, because that's not the point.
What would you describe, by the way, as his foibles?
It's everything that you and I do, but because it's you and I doing it, it's not interesting. See, it's not interesting. If Lenny hadn't written West Side Story and On the Town and all the other things that he did, we wouldn't care about all the stories of who he slept with, or who he got drunk with, or what he supposedly shoved up his nose. Who cares? But he's a celebrity, and he's Leonard Bernstein, and he's the guy that came in and taught us all about music when we were kids. So we say, look, we're living in an age where we're not supposed to have heroes anymore. We had heroes when I was a kid, and when you were a kid. We had heroes, right? And now we're not supposed to have heroes. Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's, on one level, that's a good thing, to recognize that everybody's human. But on the other hand, if you don't have heroes, you don't have anything to which to aspire.
Was Lenny a hero to you?
Of course he was.
And you said something earlier that was interesting. Lenny, for you, invented music.
Well, he invented music for a whole generation of us.
Say it again.
Lenny invented music for a whole generation of Americans, or several generations of Americans. At the time that he started the young people's concerts, we in this country, we're the ones that invented the term classical music. Americans invented that term. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist in any other culture before this, because of the way we settled this country. There was a dichotomy that existed from the beginning between the civilized Eastern Seaboard and those people going off into the frontier. And as people moved west, there was a very distinct separation between the people that were listening to cultivated music and the people that were listening to vernacular music, the music that they could take with them, the whatever folk music. And there's no other country in the world that has a Stephen Foster. We have that. So by the time the 20th century rolls around, we've been importing all of this European cultivated music. And at the same time, pop culture has been growing. And we invented this dichotomy, this chasm. Lenny believed that was ridiculous. And he was the first serious musician who went on television with serious music and showed us that it was no different than the tunes that we were humming that we heard on the radio. Lenny was as conversant with Sinatra as he was with Sibelius. And he stood there every Sunday afternoon and infused us with the same kind of enthusiasm for the music and the same fearlessness that he had. Because if he did anything, he said, don't be afraid of this. Don't be afraid of this. I remember him saying, you talked about what did he say in his cups. I can remember him one time saying, I don't understand this attitude that has developed that composers write music so that nobody can understand it. When we were doing Candide, I said to him, there's a song in Candide called Quiet. It's about boredom. And he starts it with a 12-tone row, a la Schoenberg. And then one of the characters yawns in response to that. And then he plays another 12-tone row. And one of the characters goes, ay, 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 ay. And I said, that's brilliant. I said, what made you think of that? And he says, I said, any idiot can write a 12-tone row. He said, it takes a composer to write a tune. Well, that's a very profound statement to make, right? And when I say he invented music, what I mean is that I think he was undeniably the most intelligent musician I've ever met in my life. He was the most scholarly musician I've ever met in my life. But to him, all of that scholarship and all of that learning was not there to confine, but it was there to inform so that the music could live and breathe as if it were being done for the first time, every time. And he was the most inclusive musician I've ever met. The most inclusive musician I've ever met, because to him it was all part of the same fabric. He certainly knew the difference between a Mahler symphony and, a Tin Pan Alley song that was written for some girly review. But the thing that I think that he taught me, without actually ever saying it, was that those two guys that were writing those two very diverse things were writing it from the same place. It was all coming from the same place. It was only the vocabulary that was different. And, for all we know, there's somebody out there that can respond to that Tin Pan Alley song on the same levels that somebody who needs to feel like they are possessed of some arcane knowledge can appreciate the Mahler symphony. To Lenny, it was all part of the same fabric. And I think that those of us that grew up watching Lenny on TV were inculcated with an attitude about music that is different perhaps than the way that people who grew up in other cultures, in other countries, have. Because I know that I'm 45 years old, and most of my colleagues within, say, 5 years either way of my age, all have the same kinds of broad musical interests that I do. And I think that partially that's because we're Americans and we grew up in a multi-faceted society, but it's largely due to the fact that Lenny was out there all the time. All the time. Think about it. He wrote West Side Story, and he was single-handedly responsible for resurrecting Gustav Mahler. I mean, those two things don't necessarily go together, but there he did it, didn't he? And I don't think that the way we make music as Americans would be quite so interesting and quite so rich had Lenny not come along when he did to say, yes, 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 I know that there's all this American popular music here and there's all this classical music here, but don't you guys understand that they all go together? He told me a great story about George Gershwin once. He said that and I've seen this then printed in I can't remember, in a book that I read a couple of years ago, that Gershwin, when he was sitting in his Tin Pan Alley cubicle, was practicing Bach partitas, and some of his colleagues in the tune factory came over and said, "Hey, George, what are you doing? You practicing to be a great concert pianist?" He said, "Nope, I'm practicing to be the world's greatest writer of popular songs." And that's exactly what Lenny felt about it.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
What it does, let's talk about, well, actually, because I don't want to forget it, I remember to go back to Candide. This is very interesting before we started the interview about Lenny, in a sense, being the American.
Oh, yeah.
Can you do that riff?
Yeah. Yeah, it escapes me right now who coined the term the American century to refer to the 20th century.
Loose.
That's right. Thank you very much. Henry Luce. And in some ways, I think Lenny is one of the few people who embody in one lifetime what that American century is about. Because if you look at our history, it starts, with the Spanish-American War, with America literally exploding on the world scene with tremendous optimism and a tremendous sense of there's nothing that I can't conquer. And, we go through the crucible of the Depression and World War II and everything. We finally arrive in the 50s at this state of feeling like we have arrived. We're the good guys in the white hats. There's nothing we can't surmount. And the 60s roll around, and we start questioning. And then throughout the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, we've kind of gone through a wilderness. Well, look at Lenny's life. He explodes onto the scene, replacing an indisposed colleague who is much more famous than he is. After all that preparation, after all that, youthful optimism, he bursts onto the scene. He's writing on the town in the 40s. When Lenny arrives in the 50s, he writes the central canon of what we remember Leonard Bernstein for, right? He writes Candide and West Side Story within 1 year of each other. And in some ways then spends the rest of his life trying to match that success. And no matter what he does, the general public and the critical community remembers him as the man who wrote West Side Story. Well, they remember him for more than that, and I know I'm oversimplifying. But I think that there was a kind of a wilderness through which he roamed in the last couple of decades of his life. I mean, the people that knew him and the people that, had followed him never lost sight of the fact that, the only wilderness that he went through was a wilderness of perception from other people. But
what do you mean by that?
I don't think he ever lost his genius. I've read all kinds of nonsense about how the fact that, he wrote Candide, that's the peak of his creative life, and then blah, blah, blah. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, look at all the things he wrote after that. I mean, Chichester Psalms is one of the great pieces of music that any American has composed in this century. Mass is an amazing, is just an amazing theatrical, musical spectacle, religious spectacle, spiritual spectacle. Trouble in Tahiti and Quiet Place. You take those two pieces written so many years apart, and in their own way, they're both, masterpieces. I think part of it is the fact that the American public and the American critical community, the American public, I think there's two things. The American public tends to pigeonhole people based upon that thing that is most easily recognizable about them. Right? With Lenny, it was West Side Story. Say, right, got it. Leonard Bernstein, West Side Story. The general public don't realize what a contribution he made in all these other areas of American life.
They will after this film.
Yeah, I think the critical community historically, the critical community is largely comprised of people who are either frustrated performers or frustrated composers or just frustrated. Most of them are anti-social people who confuse criticism and characterization from discernment. And most critics are very weak in discernment. And I think that I think Lenny took a lot of heat that he didn't deserve from a critical community who was jealous of his success, and from an academic musical world that was jealous of his success because Lenny could do it all. And
what a target.
Yeah, what a target. What a target. But the point is that Leonard Bernstein will be remembered, and nobody really cares about what the critics said, because nobody liked Lenny except the public. You know?
Yeah, that's true. You said in an interview, actually, you did talk about one night that you were with him
in the car.
The business about by the time Mozart was this, by the time.
Yes.
And his fear, great
Yeah.
fear that he would only be remembered as a guy who wrote West Side Story. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, well, I don't remember exactly the context in which I said this in that interview that you're referring to, but there were lots of moments when, when those of us that worked with him, at one point or another, we'd all become blubbering fans and, say things like, I can't believe I'm working with Leonard Bernstein, who am I to work with somebody like you, that sort of thing. And I think Lenny had a sense of his place in history. And he did say, well, by the time Mozart was 28, he'd done blah, 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 and I'm, going to be 70, and I haven't done that. Blah, blah, blah. I remember one incident, and I don't know whether this is the one to which you're referring, but we had just finished recording the Mozart Requiem in a little town in Germany called Diesen. It was southwest of Munich. Beautiful little Baroque church out in this village. And we had recorded for TV and also for a CD, the Mozart Requiem. After the final performance, which we had recorded, we went to the home of Karl Orff's widow. She lived on a little lake just around the corner from Diesen. And, we had one of the after concert parties for which Lenny was famous. And somehow, there were hundreds of people there, and somehow I ended up riding back in the same car with Lenny to our hotel, which was 20 kilometers away. I got in the car with him, it was about 4 a.m. Beautiful starlit night. And we got in the car, and Lenny flops himself in the back seat and looks out the window like this, silent. And off we go. 5-10 minutes pass. He reaches over and grabs my hand. My hand is on the seat next to me. And he grabbed my hand as if, were he to let go, that every molecule in his body would just dissipate. He was like hanging on for dear life. Well, I'd heard all the sordid things that people like to tell about Lenny, and I'm thinking, oh Christ, what am I going to do here? Now I have to fight Leonard Bernstein off in the back seat of my car. Within about 2 seconds, though, I realized that wasn't what that was about, and that was my, responding to all that nonsense. That I still, frankly, don't believe that the way in which most of those stories are framed is actually true, because I don't think that Lenny ever went any place with anybody unless that person opened the door and let him in. That I believe firmly. He held my hand as if he were going to float off the edge of the world were he to let go. And I didn't know what to do. And at one point he turned and sort of said rhetorically, he said, I wish there were someone in the world that understood what I'm trying to do. And then he turned and looked away and never said one more word to me. We went all the way back to the hotel. The car stopped in front of the hotel. He turned, said, "See you in the morning, kid." Got up, went up to his hotel room. What do you do in a situation? I mean, I didn't know. I had nothing to say to that. I felt like that my purpose in life at that moment was to just be there and to be another human being on whose hand he could clutch like that. And I didn't feel that there was any kind of a hidden agenda there. It was like a small child. It was like one of my kids saying, "Here, Daddy, hold me."
Well, we were just saying that for a man who spent a lifetime trying to communicate, I sometimes have the feeling that the biggest frustration at the end of his life was that he was surrounded by a bunch of people who he knew somehow didn't really get it. They didn't really
Well,
get it.
yeah, I don't think that it was necessarily when we say that he was surrounded by people who didn't get it, I don't think I think that his inner circle got it. And I think that those of us that were in the concentric circles that surrounded that got it too. But there was a large percentage of the public that only, particularly the young public, that responded to Lenny because he was a celebrity. They responded to the bang and not to the substance. And I don't know, because I've never been in a situation like that, that was that intense and that overwhelming. But I would assume that it must be really, really frustrating for somebody who did on a daily basis what he did to have people only respond to the trappings of it. It's like writing the great American novel and having somebody tell you how much they enjoyed the cover art. That had to be really frustrating to him. And to be someone who I think strove for excellence all the time in a world where people mistook his search for excellence for elitism, because he was not elite. He was the most democratic musician I've ever met, with a small d, because he was so all-inclusive and everything. It must have driven him nuts to have people responding to him because he was famous and not because of what he had done. But I guess that's the price of fame in our world.
And also to be so generally misunderstood. I mean, I think he was really misunderstood by the critics and who don't get what you are so fundamental.
Well, see, I'm cynical enough to believe that they did understand and that they let their own agendas color what they said. Because there's nothing that makes people more prone to want to topple you from your throne than succeeding without them. And I do believe that the arbiters of taste and the arbiters of what we're supposed to think held Lenny in contempt because he didn't need them. He had transcended them.
Had he really, though, in his heart?
In his heart, I don't know, because I never asked him that question, and I was not close enough to him to ask that question. But I think he had transcended it. I can tell you that since he died, something has gone out of our profession. He and Herbert von Karajan were the two great pillars of the classical music industry. They both exerted a similar kind of force in the world. And those twin pillars fell within a year of each other. And it was almost as if, well, certainly in the case of Lenny, it was almost like Lenny was a beacon out there. And even if we chose to ignore him or forget about him, he was still there. He was still giving us a frame of reference. And it's interesting to me that now we're having books written like The Death of Classical Music, and people are bemoaning the state and of our cultural life in America. I'm not suggesting that Leonard Bernstein was solely responsible for the health of our cultural life, but I think that he is certainly. I think his death marked the end of an era, and I know it'll be a long time before we see a giant like that again, because his experience was just so much a part of the of a golden age in American cultural life. His circle of acquaintances read like a who's who of American life. He was on a first name basis with everybody, and I don't see anybody out on the horizon. Even the people who are Bernstein pretenders, a lot of young conductors out there who, had coffee with Bernstein, who want to be touted as the next Bernstein. There is no next Bernstein. It's like, a totally different front. It's like somebody saying, I'm the next John Wayne. There is nobody.
It was a singular.
He's a singular. He is a singular entity, and there will never be another one quite like him.
Let's talk about Candide.
Yeah.
I don't want to forget that. He talked to you about Candide, his frustration with Candide. You say he referred to it as his...
He referred to it as the stone.
Start with Candide. Whole sentence.
Candide was the last thing I did with Lenny, and we did that project about 8 months before he died. And he had always referred to it, according to Jamie, as the stone in his shoe, because it never quite got the acclaim that, in retrospect, it seems that it should have. And that whole experience of singing the title role in that with Lenny was gosh, I could talk about that all day, that experience. The thing that I have come away from Candide thinking is that it's ironic and somehow fitting that piece is so hard for people to accept, because to me it is the perfect musical portrait of Leonard Bernstein, because that piece is everything that Lenny was. And maybe that's the reason why it's so difficult for people to come to terms with Leonard Bernstein. Because Candide is irreverent, it's caustic, it's incredibly satirical, and at the same time it's profound, and it's eclectic, and it has a broad frame of reference. It's highly literate. It's incredibly in some ways pedestrian. Some of the almost vaudevillian jokes that are used. It's everything. It's everything altogether. It's everything that Lenny was. And it's hard for people to watch Candide, to listen to Candide, and come away with a simplistic assessment of what it is they've just seen and heard. And depending upon your mood, when you hear or see Candide, you come away with something totally different. Well, that's what happened with Lenny. It depended upon sometimes what you had for breakfast or how late you'd stayed up with him the night before, singing until 5 a.m. around the piano. What you felt about him the next day.
Can you give me, actually, because I don't think I have it from anybody else, just a sort of thumbnail description of Candide? What he was doing with Candide? What it's based on? What the Really
Well, Candide is based upon a very, very satirical novello by Voltaire, in which the writings of a German philosopher who believed that because everything happens for a purpose in life, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and that even when terrible tragedies happen, when millions die because of pestilence, that it's part of a divine plan that we don't understand. Well, that could not have been farther away from Leonard Bernstein's view of the world, and certainly look at the people who helped him adapt the book, Lillian Hellman being one of the many. I think that in a way, it's about railing against, Lenny's setting of it rails against the absurdities and the injustices and the prejudices of which the world is full. And, Lenny died just at the point when political correctness became vogue. And I think it would sicken him to see something that's supposedly based in giving an equal nod to everyone's uniqueness being turned into a tool by which we push each other away from each other. And our uniqueness becomes not a way to bring us together, but a way to push us apart and make us fearful of each other. Candide is not about any of that stuff. Candide is about looking at life and saying, isn't this absurd, what we do to each other? Isn't this absurd, the kind of judgmental nonsense that goes on here that causes such suffering in the world? I mean, the finale of that, Make Our Garden Grow, is, it still moves me and makes me cry when I hear it and when I sing it. Because after going through all this stuff, the characters all say, well, I was pretty stupid, wasn't I? Why don't we just admit that we're all in this together and make our garden grow together? I don't know, in some ways maybe the text of that song is one of the most fitting legacies for Lenny, because if you ever worked with Lenny, if one ever worked with Lenny or one was ever touched by Lenny, your garden bloomed with a few more flowers that it didn't have when you started. And what was interesting to me about that Candide experience was that we didn't do it staged. We did it in a kind of a lecture concert format. And except when Lenny gave a lecture, it was never a lecture. You never felt like you were being put upon because it was so entertaining. And somehow one could see, because Lenny would speak between the numbers and give us insights into why he wrote this or why he wrote that.
What jumps out? A couple of things he said that jumped out at you?
The playfulness of it, because I can't remember the exact instance, but there is a tango that the character of the old lady sings called I Am Easily Assimilated. And there is one rhyme in there which is totally whimsical and totally based upon a bit of silliness that occurred between Lenny and Felicia, in which they couldn't find a rhyme for a particular word that Lenny had chosen. My father was born in Robo Guavernia, I think that's what it is, which is Guavernia, which is I guess a town, a little village in Russia, where one of Lenny's ancestors was born. He couldn't find a rhyme for it, and his wife Felicia came up with it to rhyme it with the word Ernia, and so she sings that, born in Rovo Guavernia, and then the chorus sings something in Spanish, which means, help me, I think I'm getting a hernia. Well, I mean, it's just nonsense, right? But it's nonsense on such a, I don't know, such a highly literate and playful level. The score is full of that sort of thing. And I think that's another thing that I love about Candide, that is, in the midst of all of the seriousness and all of the comment that's being made about the absurdity of the way people treat each other in the world, there's a tremendous amount of fun. I don't think Lenny ever didn't have fun. Even when he was conducting the most tragic piece of music, the most profoundly moving piece of music that you can think of, it was fun. It was always fun. Even when you were exhausted at the end of it, you always went away thinking, oh, let's do that again tomorrow or now.
You talked about Lenny's humanity.
Yeah.
Which is, can you talk specifically about how, because you've talked so well about his music, how you see that reflected in various works that he composed?
Well, I don't think you can possibly write the music that he wrote and not be possessed of a profound humanity. Oh gosh, so many different things. Just take West Side Story as an example. I mean, Lenny would probably hate it that I'm using West Side Story yet again as an example, but the very simplicity of most of the songs in West Side Story are indicative of profound humanity. There's a place for us somewhere, a time and place for us. How many people in the world haven't thought that at one time or another? Or the exuberance with which Tony sings, I just met a girl named Maria, and when I say her name softly, it's like praying. And then when I say it loud, there's music playing. Well, and it's one step above Moon, June, Spoon, Croon, and yet it goes right to the heart. You can't write great music if you're not humble enough to understand the value of simplicity. And I think if you look at the music of Lenny's or the music of anybody, which doesn't ultimately capture the public's attention, it's not because it's too simple, it's because it's too complicated. Because I personally have never met a stupid audience. I know Lenny shared that attitude. Perhaps they're not conversant with the subject matter that you're presenting, but if you present it in a way which speaks down to an audience is going to turn you off. And Lenny's approach with all music was to go right for the jugular and say, here's something we can all understand.
Do you think
and
that simplicity, which I share, is a great art, is part of why he was,
do you know what? I don't think Lenny ever set out to create art. Because art is a subsequent judgment that's based upon how the listener, how the receiver responds to it. You know what I think Lenny was? Lenny was the greatest entertainer who ever lived. He was the greatest entertainer who ever lived. And I mean that in the broadest possible sense of that word, because a real entertainer looks you right in the eye and engages you and says, listen to what I have to say. See if you don't feel the same thing that I feel. And boy, he did that better than anybody. Better than anybody. And I frankly think that Mahler and Beethoven and certainly Mozart and all those great composers whose music Lenny brought to life would have been happy to entertain their listeners. Because isn't that what it's about? And if it's art, that's for the listener to say. That's not to suggest that Lenny ever made music randomly, because it was beyond him to be random about anything. And You know, any great artist, anybody who we call a great artist, is somebody that possesses an understanding of the subject matter and is a supreme technician. But the great artists are not the ones who are the prisoners of technique or the prisoners of their knowledge, but they are the people who use that as a springboard to be spontaneous and to be really creative. And that's what Lenny was. But I will always think of Lenny as a great, great, great entertainer who was able, while he entertained us, to teach us, to chastise us, to mold us, and to make us think. And that's pretty good, I think.
That seems just great. Can you just turn the camera off for a minute while I just check over? Right, exactly here. Well, something about show that. What exactly what you mean when you say that when you stood in front of him, he was showing you a world without fear?
That's very, very simple. As a performer, one often feels put upon in a strange way because there is, whether it's real or perceived, performers in general feel like the sword of Damocles is hanging over their heads, and that there is an impending judgment and retribution in store for those who don't do it right. Lenny was the most fearless person I have ever met in my life, and he simply wouldn't brook any of that fear on the part of his artists. He would turn somersaults to put someone at ease so that that person, instead of trying to protect themselves from the judgments that they thought were going to be assessed by him or the critics or the public, or, you know, in the case of classical music, we often go on stage feeling as though we are being, that our goal ought to be to live up to some definitive standard of performance that someone has set for us in the past. And Lenny just didn't believe that any of that mattered, because what was most important was how did we all respond to what that composer and that person who had written the words that we were singing indicate to us that he felt when he put it on the page, or that they felt when they put it on the page. And certainly he required us to do our homework, and he required us to have thought about what we did and to have an opinion about what we did. But at the end of the day, when you stood on stage with him, all he cared about was whether you were going to go on the journey with him. And that's a very freeing experience. Very freeing experience, because it's not possible for anybody to be wrong in a situation like that. It's possible for you perhaps to make choices that aren't as meaningful to your listener at that moment as other choices might be, but there's no wrong. There's no wrong. I suppose it's very Zen. There's no trying, there's just doing.
Let me try this question on you. Were you at Lenny's funeral?
Not at the funeral. I was only at the memorial service in Carnegie Hall.
Do you know that at his funeral, the cortege went by this construction site, the construction workers stopped and took off their hats and
Yes.
said goodbye, Lenny?
Yes?
When you think about that, what's that say to you about Lenny's life?
What that says to me about Lenny's life is that, in fact, more people understood what he was trying to do than he thought. That's what I think. Unfortunately, the construction workers of the world may this be the only time that Spiro Agnew and I ever agree on anything, but the vast or silent majority of people out there I think, respected Lenny to the point where they wouldn't come up and try to take a piece of him. And I think he didn't realize how much he meant to people, how much he meant to the average person out there. Because the people that were taken with his celebrity were part of, I won't call it the lunatic fringe, but they were part of that group of people that were fanatically devoted either to his music or to his celebrity or whatever. And unfortunately, those were the only people that he saw. And he never saw the guys up on the roof of the building who, you know, maybe they wouldn't sit down and listen to a Mahler symphony, but they knew who he was. I think that's a great story. I mean, I think he did love that from wherever he was looking down, you know.
You think he might finally have said somebody did understand?
Perhaps. I like to think of him, you know, sitting in his heavenly mansion with a glass of divine scotch in one hand and, you know, an equally divine cigarette in the other hand, looking down and smiling at those guys. One of the things that I still think about was the day that I heard Lenny had died. I was surprised how I reacted to it. Because it was a mixture of two things. It was a mixture of the same thing that I felt when I heard John Kennedy had been assassinated, and it felt like I had lost a family member. I remember my wife and I hearing the news on CNN. Now, my wife met him twice, or 3 times, I think, and didn't really spend any time with him, and she started to cry. And I started to cry. And I was really, I don't know what I expected, because anybody that knew him would have responded, but I was really surprised at how profoundly upset I was. And I know that I'll go to my grave remembering where I was and what I was doing when Leonard Bernstein died.
That's interesting.
Yep.
I do have one last thing, because I actually think...
Oh, I'll tell you, yes, it was me that told this story. We were having a reception in Rome at some incredible ducal palace. And the whole cast of Bohème was there. I think it might have been after the first performance or the second performance, the concert performance. And, you know, there were the normal, there was the normal array of beautiful people there to meet Lenny and whatever. And it was well into the party. We'd been there a couple of hours, and Lenny was engaged in some conversation with an insufferable Italian aristocratic woman who was just babbling on with drivel about this and that. And I think you tell Lenny was getting really bored with the whole thing, and he was starting to fidget. And he had his opera cape over his shoulders and his cigarette in this hand and his drink in this hand. And she was going on and on and on. Started to talk about West Side Story. And you could see Lenny's eyes roll back in his head. He takes a big drag off of his cigarette and blows smoke right in her face and says, "You know what?" He said, "It's really depressing because I've done this and I've done that and I'm only going to be remembered as the man who wrote West Side Story." One of my colleagues is standing next to me who is highly medicated at that point. And he looks at me and he says, "Well, that's not so bad when you think about it, because it's better than being remembered as the man who wrote A Quiet Place." And it was, I don't know, it was very, very funny. And I told Lenny that story the next day, and he loved it. He loved it. It was a great story. It was a great story.
How do you think he felt about his own composition? You tell this story about Sondheim, which I'd love it if you forgot to.
Well, I don't know whether Lenny would actually voice this, but I did a gala honoring Stephen Sondheim a few years ago at Carnegie Hall. And somehow Lenny's name came up, as it always did. And I don't know, somehow people were talking about, well, which is a better piece, this or that. And Stephen Sondheim said, listen, he said, the only person that ever loved every note that Lenny wrote was Lenny. And I think that's probably true. He believed wholeheartedly in everything he did.